Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. So for my research project, we were looking at the impact of human activity on Vancouver Island marmot populations. So to begin, a quick background on Vancouver Island marmots. The marmots are endemic to Vancouver Island, and they are one of the few species that are endemic to Canada. And endemic basically means that they are found nowhere else on the world other than Vancouver Island. And they were proclaimed critically endangered around 2003 and 2004, where their numbers dropped to almost fewer than 30. And they were proclaimed critically endangered by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Species, also known as COSWIC. So after that, the conservation efforts increased for the marmots. And one organization worth noting is the Marmot Recovery Foundation, who has been working tirelessly to help the marmot populations and to regrow. So marmot populations grew after that, aided by human efforts, including the Recovery Foundation. And human activity has actually been found to be potentially positively influencing the marmots. And so we were looking at what impact they would have had and what impacts human activity does have. So for our project, we chose two metapopulations based on how much activity they gathered from humans. So our two metapopulations were from Nanaimo Lakes region and the Strathcona Provincial Park region. Nanaimo Lakes being the one with high human activity and Strathcona experiencing lower human activity. So for our methods, we were mainly using the data from studies done on other websites. So we used articles on Google Scholar and other websites to help us gather some data that we needed. And studies done by the Marmot Recovery Foundation, which were around 4 studies in depth done from 2018 to 2021 that went into detail about recovery, the marmots' feeding habits, winter hibernation, marmot information just in general. And then they also compared populations based on human activity. And we used that data to come to our own conclusions. And then my mentor introduced me to RStudio, which was used for our statistical analysis and for our graphs. And he's been using it for a while. And because of his knowledge about it, we were able to use that for our statistics. So for our results, we looked at the two populations, and we found that, for example, the populations with limited human influence, they were always remained 4 times lower than the populations with human influence, and they had less success in survival. So for example, winter hibernation, less of them were able to fatten up for the hibernation, or less of them would survive in the wild. And the Marmot Recovery Foundation actually detailed in their studies how they would help populations that were doing well in the wild. And they used a method called the stepping stone release method, where they would take captive bred marmots and then they would slowly introduce them into the wild. They would let them start foraging on their own in controlled environments. They would let them hibernate at least once in their lifetime before releasing them into already existing wild marmot populations in order to help boost the populations already existed. And so we assume that because of the less survival rates that the limited influence populations had, that the Marmot Recovery Foundation did not release as many marmots into those populations, just because it would not make that much of a difference, unfortunately. And the populations with higher human influence, so their numbers, as I'm going to show in the graph in the next slide, their numbers remain almost constantly above the limited influence populations, even when there are fluxes in the graph and the population numbers drop. The Nanaimo Lakes region always has marmot populations that are much higher than, for example, Strathcona. And because we believe that they have increased survival rates from human populations actually eating them, they experience more releases from captive bred marmots coming from the foundation, and they experience a bit more aid, just we assume because the foundation knows that it will help more in the long run. And so the inferences that we've made from this information is that populations with higher human influence are more successful in survival than ones with limited influence. And we took the data, and because of the marmot population's numbers, we were able to infer that that is the case. And because of the higher survival rates, we believe that they also, populations with higher human influence also experience more aid from conservational efforts. So in the graphs, here we have population numbers. We also included Mount Washington because that area also had quite a few marmot populations. And so the two meta populations, as I stated before, are Nanaimo Lakes and Strathcona. And so we can see that the Nanaimo Lakes actually is in the blue. It remains quite well above the other populations. And even though it looks here as if it has dropped below, these are the other two regions stacked on top of each other. So they are remaining increasing above the limited influence populations. And here, as I mentioned before, very high above the limited influence populations. So here are some statistics. So as I was mentioning before, the Marmot Recovery Foundation was not aiding the limited influence populations as much. And I think this is what I was trying to state before, that the expected marmot populations numbers were almost the same for both areas. And yet with high human activity, the observed marmots are much higher than limited activity. And so actually 53% of marmots are found in Nanaimo Lakes and 40% in Strathcona, and then 3% are found in the Steamboat Mountain regions. But for these two meta populations we were looking at, Nanaimo Lakes had the increased level. So a quick summary of our research. Originally, we thought that the human activity would have negative effects on the marmot population, with one of our null hypotheses being that they had no influence. And after doing our research, we were able to gather information about the marmots, and through our statistics, through our data, we are able to see that humans may actually have a positive influence on marmot populations, contrary to what we previously thought. And so one of the reasons we think that the marmots with high human activity have a better survival rate is because humans are mostly known to feed wild animals, especially tourists who are looking for like maybe more experience with the animals of the regions they're visiting. And so the feeding or discarded waste helps marmots, especially in the earlier months where they are trying to get as much food as possible to fatten up for the 6 or 7 months, up all the way to 8 months that they're going to be in hibernation. They need as much food as they can get. And so we believe that feeding will obviously very much help them in order to get to where they need to be and to complete their hibernation. And another reason could be that we ward off predators. So marmots have around 3 main predators. They have the gray wolf, they have eagles, and we have cougars. So these 3 animals, we believe human activity, such as like ski trails, hiking trails, and logging, could scare off larger predators who don't like to be around humans as much. And especially if humans don't like cougars being around them, then they will keep their distance. But marmots are less likely to be run off because of humans, especially if we are feeding them. So we believe that less predation will help the marmot populations increase their survival, as well as conservation efforts could be increasing marmot populations by, as I stated before, introducing new marmots. And so future implications, we think that these findings could help in potential future efforts to coexist with other wild animals in Canada. We believe that if the marmot populations could be experiencing positive influences from humans, then we could use that as an example or a stepping stone for future coexistence with other animals, as especially in this time of mass extinctions we are experiencing, is essential we learn how to lower that extinction rate. And obviously our study was done with data taken from other sources. And although it was taken from sources that we believe are to a high level, there are always going to be limitations and there are always going to be room for errors when we take data from other studies. And we were not able to complete studies of our own, unfortunately. Because my mentor and I both do not live close to the region and we cannot go to do studies on our own time, we were solely reliant on data from other sources, which can be a limitation for us. And just as a final note, I'd like to say thank you to my incredible mentor, Kelly Forrester. I would not have been able to complete this project without his support, without his help from like his experiences, his databases like RStudio. And I believe that it was such an amazing experience to be able to work with someone who's also doing projects on his own time and traveling and kind of showing what a future in research and ecology could be like for me. And just thank you also to Talaria for allowing me to experience this and for letting me be a part of this project.